Good evening, everyone. Woo. Thanks so much for coming. It's lovely that I know almost everyone in the audience tonight, so I appreciate you being here. Most of you know I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'm so pleased that you came for this evening's program, What Was Once Lost, the Fight for Holocaust Restitution. I'd like to start by thanking our community partners for this program, SMU Human Rights Program, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. And as always, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our board members, our volunteers, and our museum members who are here. We couldn't do this kind of programming without you. So I'm very grateful. If you're attending and you are not a museum member or a volunteer, please consider getting engaged. We'd love to have you as part of our museum family. So tonight we are pleased to welcome Mark Weitzman back to the museum. Mark has been, this is his third lecture for the museum, and we're so thankful every time he makes time for sharing his incredible knowledge with us, because he's a very busy man. He's the Chief Operating Officer of the World Jewish Restitution Organization. He is a senior member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, where he chaired the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial, and the Museums and Memorials Working Group. He was the architect of IHRA's adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism, which is the first definition of anti-Semitism with any formal status, as well as the lead author of IHRA's working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. He is co-editor of the recently published Routledge History of Anti-Semitism, which is in our library, so if you'd like to come read it or check it out, let us know. And he won a National Jewish Book Award in 2007 for Anti-Semitism, the Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal. Before Mark talks, I'd like to ask you to all silence your phones so we can limit our disruptions. And as usual, we will have time for questions. So please write your questions down on the note card, and we'll come by and pick them up, and we'll hopefully be able to answer all of your questions tonight. So now it is my pleasure to welcome Mark Weitzman.
Thank you, Mary Pat, and thank you, Caroline, who did so much work in arranging this, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I wish I could say that I know every one of you here as well, but I can't even see you actually with the lights on this way. So maybe afterwards we'll be able to say something like that. I was actually just talking to Caroline before this, and part of me said that in a way we could actually change the title of the presentation to the question of why does Holocaust restitution matter today, or why does it matter to more than the people directly involved with it? And that's what I'm going to try to answer and give you perhaps a window into looking at this subject a little differently and widening it behind. Really, when we think about the subject, very often we think about the heirs who battle over multi-million-dollar artworks, or perhaps individuals who are trying to get pensions or something in return for what happened to them and for themselves or their descendants. And yet, it doesn't seem to have any wider application. The argument I'm going to try to make tonight is that it really does have a wider application and an importance to not just to those individuals or those personally involved, but to not just even the Jewish community, but to society at large as well. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of an historical background. So I'm going to go back to the Bible. And here's a picture, probably late 19th century. Jezebel advises Ahab. And it's taken from the famous biblical story of how King Ahab and Queen Jezebel Ahab decided that he really wanted a certain property, a vineyard that belonged to somebody else. And his queen suggested to him, you're the king. As Mel Brooks said, it's good to be king. You're the king. You could do anything you want. So he did. He had the person who owned the vineyard killed, and he took the vineyard for himself. As a result of that, the famous line came from the Bible where the prophet Elijah went and reproached the king, and speaking truth to power, this is one of the earliest examples of it, where Elijah said to the king, would you murder and also take possession? In other words, is murder not enough, but you also steal and rob from the deceased? This is a fundamental question that in many ways is at odds with a Western perception. Because when you think about it, in the United States, we've always had the expression, not always, we've had the expression, to the victor belong the spoils. We've all heard that. It dates back in American history to Andrew Jackson from the 1828 campaign, presidential campaign at that point. So we have two conflicting narratives here. To the victor belong the spoils, or will you even profit from the murder that you committed? So the Holocaust, when we get to it, was one of the greatest organized thefts in history. You can read it up there. I'm not going to bother to read the whole thing to you. This was from a State Department report in 2020 that was authorized by Congress, required by Congress, and it was called the JUST Act, Justice for Survivors, Justice for Uncompensated Survivors today, and it gave the state of Holocaust restitution of basically every country that the U.S. has relationships with around the world, and the report was submitted to Congress in 2020, and you could read for yourself that officially that the State Department is announcing or saying, as we know, what happened in Europe to Jewish possessions. So with the narrative, the story, we're taking the Holocaust beyond what happened to the people, but now to what happened to their property as well. Why is that important? It was important because it was a major part of the Holocaust that we don't always consider. The economic warfare, the industrial warfare, began just a few months after the Nazis took power. If Adolf Hitler took power in January 30th, 1933, by April 1st, the Nazis were already boycotting Jewish businesses and establishments. The Nazis railed and propagandized against Jewish shop owners. They accused them of extorting from Aryans. And we know this continued even until and past Jewish deaths. You just have to consider and remember that in Auschwitz, after Jews were killed, their bodies were plundered for hair, for dentures, for gold and teeth that were all stolen and sent to be used for the benefit of the non-Jewish, particularly Aryan, in Germany. And, well, I'm going to go for a second. And even if we look at Kristallnacht, the famous November 10th, 1938 pogrom, we realize that many of you have probably seen the pictures, I think they're upstairs as well here, of synagogues burning that night. But what we don't always know or recall is that immediately after that pogrom, the day after, the Jewish community was fined 1 billion Reichmarks by the Germans, who confiscated the money from insurance claims, and the original plan for Kristallnacht called for the elimination of the Jews from the economic life of Germany, established as official Nazi policy in 1938, November 12th, 2 days after Kristallnacht. So Kristallnacht itself not only marked the first violent purge in 1,000 years on Jewish, particularly Western European Jewish population, but it marked an official declaration of economic war against Jews as well. How did this play out? We know that property was confiscated, businesses were confiscated, Jews who were allowed to leave Germany had to pay exorbitant amounts, had to turn businesses and possessions over. We're pretty much familiar with the broad outlines of that story. It wasn't just in Nazi Germany, and it wasn't just in the lands that the Nazis actually conquered. This is a document from the Wannsee Conference, translated into English. The Wannsee Conference was a conference, again, very famous in terms of the history of the Holocaust, held in a suburban villa on the outskirts of Berlin, where the plans for the final solution were formalized. Destruction of Jews in every country that the Nazis had conquered at that point, and even some that they hadn't conquered yet, but had plans for. And you can see the list on there. One of the things that was discussed there, and that's a map of Nazi-occupied Germany, Nazi-occupied Europe, and you can see how far it stretched all the way into the Soviet Union and all the way up to Spain, which was ostensibly neutral at that time, with just Switzerland in between is neutral as well. So all those countries were under Nazi sway. This term was actually called then, that slide's out of place there. I don't know why it's there. I missed that somehow. Okay, anyway, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. This is the Kristallnacht pogrom that I mentioned to you earlier. And you could see the burning of the synagogues and so on. So the lands that the Nazis overran, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe as well, they established actually task forces for looting Jewish properties, Jewish possessions, from cultural possessions to business possessions and so on. One of the most notorious was called the ERR, the Einsatzbereichsleiter Rosenberg, named after Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of Hitler's chief aides. And this unit banded out, and you could see from the arrows emanating out of Berlin where they went all over Western and Eastern Europe. And every place they went, their mission was to loot cultural objects, Jewish cultural objects. They were not the only ones. We know Hermann Göring, the number 2 man in the Nazi hierarchy, had his own private looting group. He specialized in old masters and so on for his own purposes. Hitler had plans to establish a huge museum in Linz, his hometown in Austria, with some of this looted property. But throughout there, all the way into throughout the rest of the war, wherever the ERR went, they plundered and stole. It became so well known that by 1943, in the middle of the war, before the Allies even knew that victory was going to be theirs, as the war was still at a tipping point, Normandy had not happened, D-Day had not happened, there was no Allied presence on European soil. But nonetheless, in 1943, the Allies in London issued a declaration that said that the call for the invalidity of property transfers, whether through open looting or plunder, or of transactions apparently legal in form, even when they purport to be voluntarily effected. Put that in plain English. The Allies had recognized that the Nazis were looting, and some of the looting was accompanied by quasi-legal actions that gave cover for it, such as forcing Jews to sign over property or sell property at huge discounts. And the Allies were saying that those kind of sales, those kinds of transactions were looting. They were not acceptable. They were invalid. They would not be accepted by the Allies. So already, 10 years after Hitler took power, but before the tide of the war had turned, the West was well aware of or pretty much well aware of what was happening on the economic front to Jewish property in Europe. And there you see the quotation from 1943. As the war ended, another form of looting began. The Soviets coming in from the east and heading towards Berlin, who were the ones who liberated Auschwitz and went through Poland and all the occupied areas of Eastern Europe, were not just liberators, but they were also plunderers as well. And they established what they call trophy brigades under, for example, this man Igor Grabar, and they looted whatever they could come across with. So anything that was in Auschwitz, for example, was taken back to Moscow. Some of it the Russians claimed as recompense for what they lost to the Nazis during the war. A lot of it is still in Russian hands. The picture on the right shows Putin with Angela Merkel from Germany examining some of the trophies, some of the material that they actually had from there. And we know that there are items still there that Putin, for example, had promised to return to the Greek Jewish community that were deported to us from Saloniki, particularly to Auschwitz. And this promise was made shortly before, a little while before his invasion of Ukraine. So obviously all bets are off with that right now. But we know, and it's been acknowledged, that there's Jewish property that was recovered after the war that is in Russian hands to this day. The Western Allies, as well, tried to recover property. This is Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, then General Eisenhower, looking through material at a storage depot, and you can see some of the paintings over there. And some of the other paintings and things were recovered by what a group called the Monuments Men, which are a group of American academics and art historians and so on. There's at least one British soldier member involved with that, popularized by the movie with Matt Damon and George Clooney and Bill Murray and so on. And there's a picture of them in action, the real monuments in action, restoring, taking out from a cave, taking out some of the material that they found there. That was the movie was very glorified, let me put it that way. But nonetheless, they really helped recover an immense amount, thousands of items, and they were stored in archives in the West. So what do you do with that? What happens with those archives? So some of this, for example, was in Munich, where there was art that was restored, that was taken to. Some of it was repatriated to the countries that it came from. So there are countries that to this day have collections of art that have no heirs, or the heirs are not aware of, that are sitting in national collections that were taken by the Nazis, recovered, but have never been returned to the heirs. Some, for example, material, a lot of Judaica, cultural objects, books, manuscripts, and so on, priceless intellectual material and cultural material, were stored in the Offenbach Depot in Germany. This is a picture of a major 20th century Jewish studies scholar, Gershom Shalom, who was credited with creating the field of the academic study of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And in the immediate post-war era, 1946, he spent months in Germany going through this material and basically assigning what was valuable, what was not so valuable. And a large number of the items that he looked at were eventually taken then to Palestine and became cornerstones of the Jewish National Library and the collection at the Hebrew University. But still, there was an immense amount that had to be done. By 1946, in Paris, there was another agreement that the Allies agreed that heirless assets in neutral countries have to be made available to persecutees. What that meant was the recognition that, first of all, there was property that did not have heirs. Families were torn apart, entire families were totally destroyed, people were still in DP camps, people were refugees, people had fled to, if they could, from Europe to the West, Palestine, and so on, and that their assets, the assets of those who had left without heirs, that were now in neutral countries, did not belong to those countries, but they had to be made available to the victims, those who had been persecuted. So for the first time, there was a claim, or there was an acceptance of the claim, that you did not have to be a direct heir. This could go to communal restitution, to the Jewish community, to the victims. And in November 1947, the U.S. military government in Germany passed this decree, or announced this decree, which said that they created a successor organization, which would have the right to claim the assets of those who had perished and the right to use those assets for the relief and rehabilitation of survivors. So for the first time, again, the idea was established that not to the victors belong the spoils. Contrary to that, the Allies were the victors at this point, but the spoils of war, of this looting, did not belong to them. It belonged to the community of victims and the communities in which they came, and was to be used for their relief. Now, I didn't mention, I'm not going to go into it, but at Nuremberg, for example, one of the reasons that led into part of the background that led into this decision was that in the famous Nuremberg war crime tribunals, there were sections on economic warfare or economic crimes against the Jews. And one of the people who argued that was a young lawyer named Benjamin Ferenc, a refugee from Hungary who had landed and fought with Patton, and then became a prosecutor under Telford Taylor at Nuremberg. And he was actually, as a young man, a Harvard Law School graduate in his 20s, assigned the case involving slave labor, which he obviously achieved a victory in terms of the verdict there. And Benjamin Ferenc devoted his life afterwards. He died maybe about a year ago. He was over 100 when he died, to perpetuating this work and carrying on his work for human rights afterwards as well. But from the very beginning of the attempt to deal with the post-war world and to bring responsibility to those who had committed the crimes and relief to those who had suffered from it, the economic aspect was included, even if most people found it perhaps secondary when they think about it. In June 1948, this is the authorization of the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization. This happened in June 1948. So this was the creation of what was called the Successor Organization, with the word restitution in its title. And you can see it authorizes it to recover unclaimed Jewish property and the property of dissolved Jewish communities associations in the American zone. And on the other side is a list of some of the organizations that were part of that sort of came together to create this umbrella organization. So as hard as it is to imagine sometimes, the Jewish community can come together and did come together to recognize that there was a need to establish an umbrella organization for the relief of survivors, drawing upon the assets that were going to be recovered and restored to those who had been victimized. And this was followed 3 years later, in 1951, by the birth of the Claims Conference, which many of you have heard of perhaps. The Claims Conference came together at the same time as Germany accepted the obligation to provide support to survivors, that it had an obligation to survivors, and was willing to begin to discuss material forms of compensation. I'm not going to get into the whole Israel aspect of it, because a couple of years later than that, Konrad Adenauer and David Ben-Gurion began talking about restitution to Israel, payments to Israel. It was very controversial at first. There were literally some riots on the streets in Israel against receiving money from the Germans that they thought was blood money. Eventually, obviously, they came to agree upon it, but that's a separate track. I'm going to leave that aside on it for now. I want to fast forward, though. After this, 1989 saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that was highly significant because the restitution up to that point had been going very slowly, except for the Claims Conference had been successful in negotiating with Germany and Austria on certain amounts, and as I mentioned, the payments to Israel. But on the whole, it had been very slow. The Russians obviously were not authorizing anything. Communist governments behind the Iron Curtain did not accept any responsibility. If we looked at it, there was even the question of who were the victims. Because if you looked at communist historiography of the Holocaust, there were no Jews. The most famous case being the mass grave at Babin Yar in Ukraine, where 33,000 Jews were murdered over a weekend. And if you went there, and I actually did go there in the communist period, the sign, the memorial that was up there said baldly, "Here lie victims of fascism." Nothing about who they were or why they were killed. And this played out over and over again. Everything was class warfare. It was either the Germans invading. World War II was known as the Great Patriotic War in the communists were in Russia. Or they were oppressors of the working class. But there was nothing about really Jewish victims in there. And finally, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Iron Curtain fell shortly afterwards, by 1995 or so. And a whole new period came in. And this ushered up, first of all, independence in many of these countries that were behind the Iron Curtain. It opened up a re-examination of history. This was a tangled and difficult and controversial re-examination that is still going on and still has repercussions, because national myths were involved, and politics, and religion. You had cases where countries have found it very difficult to confront their past. And some still do, Poland being a case and example. Poland, which saw itself as a victim country where Poles were more victims than Jews, and refused to acknowledge, in many cases, Polish anti-Semitism or collaboration. And obviously, not every Pole was a collaborator. And Poland did have the only country that had a national organization devoted to rescuing Jews called Żegota. But there was extraordinarily large amounts of Polish collaboration, from police to individuals, culminating in post-war pogroms and massacres of Jews who attempted to return to their villages, Kelsey being the most famous. And an attempt to this day that continues to privilege Polish victims over Jewish victims. And Poland even passed a law a few years ago forbidding, banning any attempt at restitution. So the wall came down, and all these countries came out of the Iron Curtain and began looking at their historiography, looking at their history. To deal with that, the WJRO was created, the World Jewish Restitution Organization. This, again, is an umbrella body of 14 major Jewish organizations. Some of them are some of the same groups that are listed in the JRSO grouping there. And it's our responsibility to negotiate and deal with the countries that emerged out of the former Soviet Union, with the exception of Germany and Austria, which obviously Austria was neutral and Germany was divided, but the Claims Conference deals with those countries. We attempt to negotiate, not on behalf of individuals, but to create frameworks where an agreement can be reached, where people can apply for claims and go through a process, and if the application is accepted, receive whatever was set aside by the government that we've negotiated with, receive something from them, as well as in certain cases to establish foundations that use these assets to support Holocaust education, memorials, Jewish cemeteries where there are no Jews left anymore, synagogues where there are no Jews left anymore, to support them and take care of them, and so on. 1999, 10 years afterwards, or 1998 actually, saw a major conference in Washington called the Washington Assets Conference. And there's a picture of then Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, who was Undersecretary of the Treasury, Undersecretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State, with a delegate from, believe it or not, Russia, who they had negotiated and agreed, and this was announced by the 47 countries that were there, a set of principles called the Washington Principles on Nazi looted art. And it's like a 1,000-page record of that came out. That's the volume that came out with it. I was actually one of the panelists there in the panel dealing with education, because throughout this whole process, it's not just been about the money. It's not just been about the property. It's been about education. It's been about memorialization. It's been about history as well. So to bring it up to date, where we stand now, we have certain countries that over the past couple of years, that's the Washington Conference Principles, on the State Department website. And so already that gives you an idea that one of our biggest partners on it, remember we began with the JUST Act, which was mandated by the US Congress, a report by the State Department. Here we see on the State Department website the principles, the Washington Principles, meaning that our chief partner throughout all this endeavor has been year in and year out, administration in, administration out, the United States government. The level of support has been bipartisan and strong and significant, because we could not have achieved anything without the US government really working with us hand in hand on it. So in recent years, saw some successes, for example, Luxembourg, which is not necessarily Eastern European at all, but a major success there where the government announced they've gone through, they're examining the banking records there, dealing with setting aside money for those who fled and were deported, as well as taking the site of the deportations and turning it into a former nunnery convent and turning it into a memorial site, an educational site. And here's the U.S. ambassador posing and part of the memorial that was created from Luxembourg. The agreement was from October 2020, relatively recent. Here is an announcement from Lithuania, where, again, the Lithuanian parliament, with the approval and under the urging of the government, assigned earlier a year ago 40 million euro as a symbolic payment to Lithuanian survivors, and to revitalize. At the same time, Latvia assigned a major payment to revitalize Latvian Jewish community, Holocaust memorials, and similar things of that nature. Those are success stories. Countries that we're having difficulty with include, for example, Poland, as I mentioned earlier. Hungary, another country which has, in many ways, refused to deal with the Holocaust directly. The Hungarian government, for a long time now, under the current government, has acknowledged that the Holocaust took place, but basically blamed it on Germans, which is a motif that we find in many countries, a theme, where it's much easier to blame the Germans who came in than rather confront the issue of local collaborators. Hungary is a pretty glaring example, because we know, for example, that most of the deportations from Hungary took place in 1944, didn't begin until 1944. The Hungarian community was relatively not going to say unpersecuted. There was forced labor, there were many deaths, there was persecution, but the deportations did not begin until 1944. But the Nazi unit that was in charge of the deportations, headed by the infamous Adolf Eichmann, never numbered more than approximately 120 people, and there were over almost 450,000 Hungarian Jews deported. Do the math. They needed a lot of help. Those 120 people needed a lot of help and got a lot of help. And even after the Germans pulled out, I don't know if any of you have been to Budapest, but at the banks of the Danube River, there are a series of bronze shoes set on the ground at one point. Those shoes are there to mark when the Hungarian Iron Cross, Hungarian, not Nazi, not German, decided that they were going to murder Jews, march them to the banks of the Danube, shot them, but before they shot them and pushed them into the bodies into the river, made them take off their shoes, because shoes were more valuable than people. Another example of the economic warfare or the property that we were talking about earlier. And that's what those bronze shoes are there to memorialize, the row of shoes left by the victims as they were murdered. So, Poland, as a matter of fact, when the Just Act was released, the only country that had not only rejected it in many ways, some of their politicians with extreme anti-Semitic statements, but literally had demonstrations against the Just Act, which was just a report on the status of restitution, was Poland. And you could see that they conflated the Holocaust, Israel, Zionism, anti-Semitic, all in one anti-Semitic package. Not for the Holocaust industry, not for Zionism. A sign from one of the demonstrations that were organized, sometimes with some official Polish help, against the Just Act. So, a couple of weeks ago, I guess it was last month, beginning of last month, March 5th, we had a meeting in Washington that was co-sponsored by the State Department and held at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In that meeting, a group of countries that had come together because they have special envoys on dealing with Holocaust issues. There are about 14 countries. We, WJRO, had created a network of these envoys, giving them an opportunity to meet together on a regular basis, to communicate with each other, discuss what was important, what was helpful, what was not helpful, and so on and so forth, in an ongoing atmosphere. And we had met earlier in London the year before that a second meeting in Washington in past November. And in these meetings, it was decided we wanted to look at those Washington principles of looted art that I mentioned from 25 years ago, 1998, and see if they are applicable in the same way, what 25 years has brought to us, and so on. And as a result, we created a package of best practices to those 1998 principles. And these are best practices of Nazi looted art. And we brought it out there, had the endorsement of 23 countries signing on and endorsing it, the first time in 15 years that countries had actually taken some movement on this issue. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of the kind of things that we're talking about. Because I mentioned earlier before, and I don't know how many of you saw the movie The Woman in Gold, for example, but you're familiar with, and you've probably seen stories about heirs trying to recover paintings that are worth millions and millions of dollars. And these figures seem astronomical, and it sort of seem out of our control, and it's hard to relate to it. It's really, I mean, I've been working on this, and it's still hard for me to relate to someone trying to recover a painting worth $300 million. It's a different planet that I'm used to working, to living on. But that's not what we're talking about only. Those cases exist, but that's not the prime focus or the only focus. Because there are other places or other instances. For example, this is a shofar, a ram's horn used on ceremonial religious occasions, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and so on. And this is a ram's horn held by a family, by a woman who she obviously recognized it there, where she talks about it, that this was her family's possession, and the last she saw of it, she was able to hold it, it was in a library in a town in Hungary, a village in Hungary, and she has never been able to recover it. They have not been able to get anything back from it. There's no record of what it was, of where it is right now, and a family heirloom is out of reach. This is a picture of a Czech family. Before the war, they were the largest vineyard, owned the largest vineyard in the Czech Republic. Well, Czechoslovakia, I guess, at that point, and so on. It was obviously confiscated. He has been trying to recover it or part of it or get some restitution for it unsuccessfully for 20 years now. All sorts of legal obstacles are put up on it. But I took this because I want to show you the human side of it. We talk about numbers, 40 million euro here, 300 million for a picture, whatever. This is a family. They're standing on their property, on their home. When people were dispossessed, it wasn't just that they were forced into exile. Their world was uprooted. They were cut off from the things that mattered to them, from their homes, from their families, from their religious possessions, from their heritage. And those are the things that we're trying to recover as well. You can't restore the memories, or you can't recover what was lost, even in terms of the memories and the connections. But you can establish something that links together, that tells you where you came from, who you are today. Gives your children something to hold on to and something to build. The campaign against Holocaust restitution is very often built on a campaign of Holocaust distortion. I mentioned Poland, I mentioned Hungary. The idea is very simple. If you distort, if you play around with who the victims were, what happened to them? If you play around with who is responsible, you evade responsibility. You don't have to pay. You profit. You keep the money, you keep the possessions, you keep the factories, you keep the land, you keep the cultural objects. Because if everything else is uncertain, the law rests on facts, on establishing the facts of a case. If you can keep that juggling and keep that unclear, you can keep profiting. So this is just a quick example of Wikipedia. It's an article from a scholarly journal, came out fairly recently, about a year ago, on Wikipedia's intentional distortion of the history of the Holocaust. And most of it references Poland, or I'm not saying official necessarily, but Polish attempts to use Wikipedia and distort Wikipedia's reporting on what happened during the Holocaust. That's how deep the roots of Holocaust distortion still go today. This is that special envoys meeting in London that I mentioned to you. What's important about that was in the center there, the man is told with the blue tie and white shirt was the then Foreign Secretary of the UK, who took the time to come down from his day, to come down to our meeting, spend a few minutes and tweet about it afterwards. And that, again, the UK has been a strong partner in this as well. That gives you extent of what we're talking about is not just a US issue or not just a Jewish issue. It's an international issue, a policy issue. This is the story from the March 5th event that I just mentioned to you. And the picture is Ambassador Eisenstadt, Stu Eisenstadt, who is still at work. 25 years after the Washington conference, he's a special advisor to the Secretary of State today, and he is still trying to urge and to accomplish and complete as much as he can work on restitution. While we were at that meeting, you know what, I'm going to skip that. While we were at that meeting, there was a message given by Secretary of State Blinken. And again, I want to acknowledge that Secretary of State, with everything going on in the world today, took time out. He couldn't be there in person. He taped the message. It was, played there. And he acknowledged that, I'm quoting now, heirs confront staggering legal and financial barriers as they go up against opponents whose resources vastly outmatch their own. But he also talked about, and again, a quote, these efforts are more important than ever as Holocaust distortion and denial are again on the rise. We have seen again, time and time again, how the individuals, groups, and societies who downplay or refute the Shoah foster anti-Semitism and violence against Jews. These best practices offer critical tools to counter their efforts to forget, to obfuscate, by memorializing the truth about what the Nazis did, who they hurt, and what they took. Restitution cannot right all the wrongs, but it is a clear affirmation of what had occurred. And it represents a small step toward giving something back to families and communities who lost everything, much of which can never be replaced. At a time when polls show that, for example, 48% of US millennials and Gen Z, that's ages 18 to 39 for those older than that, could not name a single one of more than 40,000 concentration camps or ghettos established during World War II. Nearly 2/3 did not know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, and nearly half, 49%, have seen Holocaust denial or distortion posted on social media or elsewhere. It is more important than ever to establish the historical record, not just in terms of the numbers of the victims, but in terms of what they lost, what was stolen from them. And it goes beyond that. The image that I have up here, you can see Vladimir Putin used false Nazi narrative to justify his invasion of Ukraine. This is a headline from NBC. Putin is joining many other Holocaust distorters. We mentioned what's going on in Poland, Hungary, and places like that as well. I could keep going on. But I want to go to one last image, which is former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Shortly after the January 6th events at Capitol Hill, focused in, and that's the headline, slams punk who wore a Camp Auschwitz hoodie at Capitol riot. And I always wondered, when I saw that press conference, I wondered to myself, Nancy Pelosi is a very tough politician, woman. You don't have to get to where she is in politics by having a thin skin. Whatever you agree or disagree, whatever, we acknowledge that she achieved a high level of political position in the United States, and that is not an easy thing to do for anyone, particularly a woman at that point. And yet, she was visibly moved. And why did she single out, with all the garb that was seen at that January 6th, with horns and hats and uniforms and capes and I don't know what. Why did she focus on this guy wearing the Camp Auschwitz shirt? And I think what happened was that she instinctively, I'm not sure if it was even rational, understood something and was trying to maybe acknowledge a point. If not, maybe I'm reading into it. But this is how I looked at it as well. The attack on Auschwitz, this is distortion, by the way. It doesn't say that Auschwitz didn't exist. It's not denial. It's distortion. It was a camp. What does camp mean in American connotation? Place for kids to go in the summer and enjoy themselves. So yeah, clearly denial/distortion, whatever. But it's deeper than that. Because one of the things that we have to recognize is that our liberal democracy, and liberal small l, not liberal conservative, just liberal democracy, was shaped and formed out of the ashes of World War II. The institutions that were created out of that, and again, look at their ideals. We're not talking about whether they achieve their ideals, whether they're in good shape or bad shape, or whether we agree, whatever. Just the ideal that was created for the UN, for the EU, for NATO, was in many ways to create a world order where the Holocaust and a mass war like World War II could not happen again. Even concepts, it was out of order, but let me just go back very quickly to the concept of genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a refugee from Lviv. The idea of war crimes tribunals, crimes against humanity, grew out of Nuremberg and efforts afterwards. The idea of, even the basic idea of human rights grew out of that world. The attempt to avoid anything like the Holocaust ever happening again. This is one of the reasons why the communist world distorted the historiography of the Holocaust. They understood that it was a fundamental underpinning of our liberal society and order. And they could not accept that. And in that sense, Putin is a true heir of his KGB schooling. But that's why establishing the historical record becomes even more important. And that's what Tony Blinken was saying. If we want to create a world where the lessons of what happened are actually learned and acted upon, then finding some measure of justice that will give the survivors, the victims, back what they lost. Because they can never get everything back. We can't restore the people. We can't give back all the possessions. But if we can establish the historical record, if we can ensure that people are aware of the enormity of the crime, if we can show some form of responsibility and some form of justice for the victims and their heirs, then we go a long way to helping undergird and strengthen any hope for democracy in our lifetime and in the future. Thank you.
Please let our volunteers know. They'll be coming around to pick up questions. I have a couple to start with. Thank you. Thank you. It's clear that you're very passionate about this work. so I hear your passion, but can you share with us what personally prompted you to join WJRO and seek restitution for these families?
I usually don't get asked personal questions at these things. Um, Before I joined WJRO, I spent a few decades working at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And I had the incredible good fortune of becoming very close to Simon Wiesenthal himself. And for those of you who know the name, he needs no introduction. For those who don't, he was a Holocaust survivor who, after the war, devoted his life to what was considered Nazi hunting, bringing Nazis to justice. He did not and fought against the concept of revenge, but he wanted to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive and bring people to justice. Being close to him obviously would have an impact. So my family is not a survivor family, it's not anything like that, but the concept of finding justice in the world, of trying to prevent any kind of similar threat or impact became very important to me. And in recent years, I've also been, became an expert in Holocaust denial and distortion as well, as I saw it playing out both in American extremist groups or international extremists, and there's a network of Holocaust deniers, generally on the extreme right, but there are also some in left and some in some religious circles, particularly Catholic and so on. Again, extreme, very small numbers, nowhere near the established Catholic Church or centers of political or social power. But nonetheless, I saw that. Then I saw Holocaust distortion growing out of that, or allied with that in a way, that was impacting our political world, including cases in the United States perhaps, but certainly foreign governments, and the necessity for dealing with that and confronting that became more and more urgent as we see history under attack as well these days. So the opportunity came a couple of years ago to join WJRO and to really focus on this aspect. And I think the way I see it, it's and what I've tried to bring home a little bit here is that it's not just an argument for the dollars. It's an argument for history. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an extremely important task in today's world.
I think the urgency is also dictated by the fact that we are, at some point very soon, we will have lost all of our survivors. What kind of challenges does that timing present for restitution? Are the children and grandchildren of survivors also involved in these efforts?
Children and grandchildren are involved in these efforts. We talk about heirless, and we talk about communal property, we talk about movable, immovable property, cultural property. There are all sorts of different classifications, and I could spend a lot more time if I went into one or the other or tried to sort of separate them, untangle them. But unfortunately, I kind of packed them all up here in one big, giant, presentation to give you an idea about it. So yeah, children and family are involved in some cases. We know of them and we work with them very closely. There are cases, I didn't get into it, but there was a case in Croatia. There was a story last spring about Croatia acknowledging some issues with art and deciding to do a report and so on and so forth. The Times story that we worked with the Times on, getting it out and everything, featured an interview with a woman in Florida who was trying to recover a painting. The painting was of herself as a little girl, and she was trying to get it back. So there are direct connections sometimes. That vineyard, the man who gave us the picture of the vineyard was the little boy in that picture. The woman holding the shofar, that was her family, heirloom. There are all these individual and tight connections. We can't negotiate on behalf of individuals. We don't do that. We can highlight their stories and so on, but we want to create a framework where there's an agreement with let's say the government of the Czech Republic or whatever, that if it's proven, if the connection is proven and legitimate and so on, then they will get, if not the vineyard back, but they will get a payment for it or something for that. If the heirs can't be traced, then it's communal property. And we work with Jewish communities in a lot of these countries, in Poland, in Lithuania, and other places like that, where there are foundations set up that we're partners with the local Jewish community. And the money there goes to support everything from soup kitchens to Holocaust memorials, to Jewish centers, to educational activities. The money is used for the greater good if it can't be given back directly to to heirs and families, and if we can convince the government that they should be making larger scale payments to support these activities.
Mark, you said this work would not have happened without the support of the U.S. government. What do you think prompted the U.S. to actively promote Holocaust restitution?
That's a really good question. I think it was just something that was beginning to go in the late 1990s, mid 1990s. There was a series of revelations in countries. Switzerland, for example, with the Swiss banks. There was a conference in London about gold that had been looted, and it became clear that no one's hands were clean, including the U.S. And it was at a time where there was a sense of openness. Perhaps it was in connection with the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was an openness to the countries that had been coming out of, as I said, the Iron Curtain, who were re-examining their own paths. But there was a whole series of events. I mentioned the Washington Conference. 2000 was a meeting in Stockholm, again, of over 40 countries. That was the birthplace of this IRA, this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It was the brainchild of the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, Göran Persson, not Jewish, but who both had a sense of morality and practical politics, that this was the time to do something like that. So all these things were circulating. It was also the time that some of the major Holocaust museums, for example, had been opened or were opening a few years previously. There was an interest. It was a confluence of a number of factors. There was President Clinton ordered declassification of Holocaust-era records in U.S. archives. There were things that came out, revelations then about how the CIA had used Nazi war criminals at the same time. We know, that there are all sorts of connections that we're still uncovering in many ways. We know Nazi scientists were brought into the U.S. and helped create the U.S. space program. One of them had a statue just taken down in his honor, Wernher von Braun, taken down by NASA about a year ago in Alabama, in Huntsville. They finally took the statue to him down. This was a man who had used slave labor in creating the V-2 rockets that targeted London for the Nazis. So no one's hands were clean. Maybe ours were a little cleaner than the Russians, but we all had history that needed to be examined. And I think all this came together roughly at the same time.
Could you talk a little more about the legal process of removing stolen objects and arts from museums and returning it to the rightful heirs? Are you involved with that helping create those frameworks to make that possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complicated issue because, first of all, part of it depends on the stuff that we did, the Washington assets, the best principles, the principles and the best practices are all voluntary. They're not legally binding. They can be endorsed by governments, but they don't have statutory power. So it depends on each country's individual reaction and laws. And because a lot of these are international, sometimes there are conflicts between laws. So there were cases in the U.S. where heirs tried to sue in California, for example, a Spanish museum, and the case went against the heirs because it was just the decision came down that it was not a U.S. interest to go into, and so on and so forth. And it's now on appeal. It's as I said, it's a major, complicated things. In the Netherlands, for example, there was a whole collection of art that was looted, recovered, and was stored in museums. And the Netherlands, for a long time, for a number of years, had the principle of what was most important for the public good, returning it or keeping it in the museum where more people can see it, even if it didn't belong to them originally. They finally, just in the past year or so, backed off that policy. So there are different approaches, and I mean, to get into that, I can't give like a quick one answer, but there are different approaches. Sometimes it's state law that gets involved. There have been cases in New York. Their art was seized and recovered. There are a couple of cases where Homeland Security recently has intervened in auctions of cultural material, pinkasim, which were Jewish communal registers that clearly belonged to a community, not to an individual, but were put up by private auction homes and have been seized by Homeland Security, DHS, until the legal question is resolved on it. Because once it's sold to an individual, you lose track of it. You don't know. But one of the things that we're trying to do is to work with museums. We've been successful in working with Sotheby's, with Christie's, to establish provenance research, which means the research, the train of ownership. And if you see gaps, if you see questions, if you see things that are questionable, you can proceed from there. But we're trying to make them aware of it. In Croatia, for example, we're working to train researchers to go through their state museums and deal with it. So it's an ongoing process, and it's international in scope.
And this is related to that. What kind of methods are used to determine the original owners of the object? I mean, you don't have a purchase receipt for many of these things, right? Or there pictures in their homes?
Sometimes you do. Some of the cases that have been the defendants or whatever, the ones who own it now, have claimed that the original sale was legitimate because there is a bill of sale that shows that, let's say, person X, who was Jewish, sold it to a German dealer for so many Reich marks. Mm-hmm. Obviously, very often, the price that was paid was way undervalued, and it was done under duress. And that's one of the reasons why, if you recall, I mentioned that there were certain statements and declarations that transfers of objects under duress would not be considered valid. So that still you have to play out, and you have to go through and show what it was worth then, and show what it's worth now, and so on and so forth, and establish that it was under duress. And there are some cases where courts have ruled, not usually in the U.S., but some foreign courts have ruled that, it didn't matter because as long as they have the bill of sale, they're not going to argue against it or rule against it. So it's not a simple thing, but that's one way of doing it. Provenance research, as I mentioned, is another way. Sometimes it's visual evidence. If you have pictures of something that was in a collection or was in someone's home or something, and you can establish that, you may have something to stand on. But it's a whole field. It's a scholarly, legal, and detective field in its own right.
So this question, it really gets at the crux of what you're trying to do with WJRO. It says, would you consider there to now be a comprehensive system of Holocaust restitution, or is the lack of one part of the problem or the challenge?
Yeah, no, there is no comprehensive, because each country that we work with, excuse me, we negotiate directly with that country, and countries can come up with different responses, and sometimes there's no positive response. So there is no comprehensive overall settlement, and there are issues of political, and as I mentioned earlier, of national myths, of political issues, along with the legal issues that go along with it, which is one of the reasons why it wasn't so simple to get this best practices even endorsed by 23 countries. We think more will sign on because it literally just happened a month ago, and it's still in the process. But that was a major achievement. But we could not have done it if we said it was legally binding, for example. I don't even know if the United States would have agreed to that, because U.S. law is very different than continental law, European law, for example. So I don't know if we could have gotten that quote-unquote comprehensive, and so we're not even looking for that. We're looking, for, as I said, best practices, a set of principles, something that are internationally accepted voluntarily, and then acted upon by the countries that we work with.
So, last question. How can we best follow along with the work of the WJRO and share this information with others and be supportive?
Well, I guess the best way to say to follow along is through our website, which is WJRO.org.il. We're technically headquartered in Israel, which is .il, even though we work out of New York. Excuse me. In terms of following, that's the best way to follow along with our work. In terms of supporting and letting people know, I think is similar. We're in a position where we're not asking for people to give us money. I'll be very upfront about that. We basically work through the funds that come from the claims conference that are supported and so on. We don't have fundraising campaigns or things of that nature. But what we do need and could always use are people's support of letting people know that this is an issue that is ongoing, that it's not just an issue, as I said, for, the heirs of a Picasso, which is kind of out of touch with the way most people live. But it's a chauffeur. It's a small object as well. And it's the connection between people and where they came from that was robbed from them. And it's about our society. Is it a society that condones murdering and then profiting? As the prophet condemned? Or is it a society that values history? That really recognizes the importance of establishing what happened? Not just the good, but the bad, and trying to learn from it. I think it's important that people know that we're doing this and why we're doing it. As I said, we don't take individual cases. We don't get a profit from it. You're not going to see us on the billboard on the highway outside saying, if you had an injury, call us. But the reality is that I think what we're doing, as I've tried to say, has implications both for those who are involved directly, for the Jewish community, and as we see, even international politics and policy. And in that sense, if you can share that with others, share that with us, join us with that, then that's the kind of partnership we hope to achieve.
Mark, thank you so much. Thank you for your work. Thank you. Thank you for helping confront Holocaust distortion and denial and providing this evidence for all of us. We really appreciate it. Thank all of you for being with us. I think we have a small enough group that you might be able to find Mark in the lobby for a question if I didn't get to your question, but I appreciate you all being here. Good night.